In late August of 2023, a senior American official, the United States Secretary of Commerce, was in Beijing on a diplomatic visit, trying to steady a tense relationship between the world's two biggest economies. And on roughly the same day, with no press conference, no big launch event, no fanfare at all, a Chinese company quietly put a new phone up for sale on its website. That company was Huawei, and the phone was the Mate 60 Pro. The timing was not an accident. It was a message. Because Huawei was supposed to be finished. For years, the United States had hit it with some of the most aggressive technology sanctions ever aimed at a single company, restrictions specifically designed to cut it off from the advanced computer chips that make a modern smartphone work. The explicit goal was to choke off Huawei's access to cutting-edge technology, and for a while, it worked. Huawei's once mighty smartphone business collapsed. It is hard to overstate how far Huawei had fallen. Just a few years earlier, it had been on track to become the largest smartphone maker on the planet, outselling Apple and closing in on the top spot worldwide. Then the sanctions hit, in waves. First, Huawei was cut off from key American software and components. Then, in a devastating second blow, the rules were tightened so that any chip maker anywhere in the world using American technology, which is essentially all of them, was forbidden from manufacturing Huawei's chip designs. That single move severed Huawei from TSMC, the Taiwanese giant that had been building its most advanced processors. Overnight, Huawei could no longer get the brains for its best phones. Its smartphone sales fell off a cliff. It was forced to sell off an entire sub-brand just to keep part of the business alive. By most outside accounts, Huawei's days as a maker of cutting-edge phones were simply over. That is the context that makes what happened next so extraordinary. And then, in near silence, it released a phone that should not have been possible. People rushed to buy it and tear it apart to see what was inside, and what they found sent a shockwave through Washington. Here is what we actually know, and on this topic, it is important to be precise, because the details are where the truth lives. A firm called Tech Insights, which specializes in taking chips apart and identifying exactly how they were built, got hold of the phone and examined its processor. They confirmed that the chip, called the Kirin 9000S, was designed by Huawei and manufactured inside China by the country's top chip maker, SMIC, using SMIC's second-generation 7-nanometer process. And crucially, it was made without the single most important machine in advanced chip making, a machine the sanctions had specifically banned China from buying. In plain terms, China had manufactured, at home, a class of advanced chip that the entire American sanctions strategy had been built to prevent. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why this one chip rattled the most powerful government on Earth, how it was actually made, and the deep irony that the effort to stop China may have done the opposite. To understand why a single phone chip caused a political crisis, you first have to understand the chip war itself, and one number that controls everything. Modern computer chips are described by a measurement called the process node, written in nanometers, like 7 nanometer, or 5, or 3. For our purposes, you do not need the physics. You just need one rule. The smaller that number, the more advanced the chip. A smaller number means more tiny transistors crammed into the same space, which means more speed and power and efficiency. The whole global technology industry is in a permanent race to make that number smaller, and for years, the most advanced chip makers in the world, led by Taiwan's TSMC, have been at the very front of that race, while China has trailed years behind. The United States decided to use that gap as a weapon. Worried that advanced chips could power China's military and its artificial intelligence, Washington rolled out sweeping export controls, restrictions designed to freeze China's chip industry in place. The strategy had a specific target. The rules were intended, in effect, to lock China at around the 14 nanometer level, a generation of technology that was already several years behind the cutting edge. The plan was to let China have the old stuff, while denying it the tools to ever catch up to the front of the race. And the keystone of that entire plan, the linchpin, was a single, almost unbelievable machine. That machine is called an EUV lithography system, and it is one of the most complex devices humanity has ever built. It uses an extreme form of ultraviolet light to carve features into silicon almost unimaginably small, and it is essential for making chips at the cutting edge. Here is the staggering part. There is exactly one company on the entire planet that can make a complete one, a Dutch firm called ASML. Each machine costs hundreds of millions of dollars and is built from hundreds of thousands of parts. And under American pressure, the Netherlands agreed not to sell these EUV machines to China at all. This was the masterstroke of the sanctions. The thinking was simple and seemed airtight. To make a truly advanced chip, you need EUV. China cannot get EUV. Therefore, China cannot make a truly advanced chip. The whole strategy rested on that one logical chain. And that is exactly the assumption the Kirin 9000S broke. That is the twist at the heart of this story, because it turns out the sanctions were built on a belief that was almost, but not quite, true. The belief was that EUV is the only practical way to make a 7nm class chip, and SMIC proved that only was wrong. They reached that advanced node without any EUV machine at all, using older technology the sanctions had not banned. To see how, you have to understand what these machines actually do. They use light to print the chip's pattern onto silicon, and normally, the finer the pattern you want, the shorter the wavelength of light you need. EUV uses an extremely short wavelength, which is why it can print such tiny features in a single pass. The older, allowed machines, called DUV, use a longer wavelength of light, which on its face should be too coarse for the job. So how do you print a feature finer than your light is really meant to allow? You cheat with patience. The technique is called multi-patterning, and the idea is almost brutally simple. Instead of printing the whole fine pattern in one shot, you print part of it, then shift slightly and print again and again, layering multiple careful exposures on top of each other to build up a pattern finer than any single pass could manage. It is the difference between a printer that can render a perfect image in one stroke and an artist who achieves the same detail by going over the canvas many times by hand. The result can look similar, but the second way takes far longer, costs far more, and ruins far more attempts along the way. That is what SMIC did. It took the older DUV machines it was still allowed to buy, and through painstaking multi-patterning, squeezed out of them a 7nm class chip that the sanctions had assumed was impossible without the forbidden machine. They did not smuggle a banned tool, they got the banned result with the allowed tool. By accepting a level of difficulty and cost the West assumed no one would tolerate. So does this mean the sanctions failed completely? That China has caught up and the whole strategy was pointless? That is the question everyone screamed after the teardown, and the honest answer is more interesting and more balanced than either side wants. If you are finding this as fascinating as I am, take a moment to subscribe, because getting this next part right, the part both the cheerleaders and the doommongers get wrong, is the whole reason this story matters. Here is the balanced truth. On one hand, this was a genuine and significant achievement, and a real embarrassment for the US strategy. China demonstrated it could domestically produce a class of chip the sanctions were explicitly designed to prevent, and Chinese state media proudly noted the phone contained thousands of domestically made components. A senior analyst called it embarrassing for the US Commerce Department because the chip crossed thresholds the sanctions had drawn as red lines. That part is real, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. But on the other hand, the doommongers overshoot just as badly. This chip did not put China at the front of the race. That SMIC 7nm process is roughly 5 years behind the genuine cutting edge. In the same month this phone appeared, Apple's newest iPhone was already using a far more advanced 3nm chip from TSMC. So China had not caught up. It had reached, at home, where the leaders had been about half a decade earlier, and it did so at a punishing price. Multiple analyses indicate that making these chips this way suffers from low yields, meaning a large share of the chips produced come out defective and have to be thrown away, with reports putting the yield well below half and the cost per chip far above what TSMC pays. The US Commerce Secretary herself made the point bluntly, saying there was no evidence China could make these 7-nanometer chips at scale. So this was not a company beating the sanctions and turning a healthy profit. It was a state-backed effort willing to burn enormous amounts of money to achieve a strategic result the market alone would never justify. Both things are true at once. It was a real breakthrough, and it was an expensive, limited one that left China still years behind. Anyone selling you only one of those halves is selling you a side. And yet, inside China, the half that mattered was the triumph, and the reaction told you everything about why this chip was never really about the chip. People lined up outside Huawei stores. The phone sold out. State media and ordinary citizens alike treated the Mate 60 Pro not as a gadget, but as a symbol, proof that the country could be punched in the face by the world's most powerful nation and punch back. Huawei's founder had, years earlier, framed the sanctions as a fight for survival, and now here was the evidence that survival was possible. The phone became a national rallying point, a piece of consumer electronics carrying the weight of a country's pride. That emotional charge, far more than the transistor count, is what made this a geopolitical event and not just a product launch. A chip had become a flag, and the single most important reason China is still behind brings us right back to that one machine. EUV. Because here is the wall that the 7-nanometer workaround does not climb. Multi-patterning with old DUV machines can stretch to 7-nanometer, painfully. It can perhaps be pushed toward 5-nanometer, even more painfully, with even worse yields and costs. But the further down you go, the more the whole approach buckles under its own difficulty. To mass-produce the truly leading-edge chips, the ones powering the most advanced artificial intelligence, efficiently and affordably, you still really need EUV. And China still cannot buy one, and has not yet built its own working one at production scale. The head of ASML, the company that makes them, has estimated China remains 10 to 15 years behind on this core technology. So the choke point that the whole sanctions strategy was built around is, in the most important sense, still holding. The Kirin chip bent the sanctions. It did not break the choke point. And EUV is not even the only wall. Making an advanced chip is not one machine, but an enormous chain of them, plus the specialized software used to design the chips in the first place, an area where a small number of mostly American companies hold a near monopoly. Cut off from the best of that software and the most advanced tools across the whole chain, China has to rebuild not just one miraculous machine, but an entire industrial stack, link by link, each one years of work. This is why even genuine breakthroughs come with an asterisk. Beating the EUV assumption at 7-nanometer was real, but the leading edge is defended by many walls, not one, and most of them are still standing. China is climbing all of them at once, which is extraordinary, but it has not reached the top of any of them yet. So if the sanctions are still holding the line on the most advanced chips, were they a success? And here is where the story takes its final and most ironic turn. Because there is a powerful argument that the sanctions, whatever they blocked, triggered exactly the outcome they were meant to prevent. If you want to understand the deepest consequence of this whole saga, this is the moment to subscribe, because what the pressure did to China's ambitions is the part that will still matter in 20 years. Think about it from China's point of view. Before the heavy sanctions, China bought most of its advanced chips from foreign companies because it was cheaper and easier than making its own. Chip self-sufficiency was a long-term industrial goal, a someday ambition, but there was no screaming urgency because the global market supplied what China needed. The sanctions changed that overnight. By cutting Huawei and others off, the United States turned chip independence from a nice-to-have into a desperate matter of national survival. It signaled to Beijing, in the loudest possible way, that relying on foreign technology was a fatal vulnerability that could be switched off at any moment. And a country like China, with enormous resources and a state that can direct them, responded exactly as you would expect. It poured staggering sums into building a domestic chip industry, with government support for the sector reported in the range of well over $100 billion, and the personal attention of China's top leader. An entire national mobilization, with companies, universities, and the state all pushing toward one goal: de-Americanizing the supply chain. As one Chinese industry figure reportedly put it, "Your technology controls are helping China achieve its industrial policy goals." The Kirin 9000S was the first dramatic public proof that the mobilization was working. So step back and look at the real significance of this one chip in a phone, because it is the same pattern that keeps surfacing across Chinese industry just under the most intense pressure imaginable. The achievement was never really the single chip. It was what the chip proved, that under a total siege designed to stop it, China had assembled a working, domestic, end-to-end ability to design and build an advanced processor without the West. The design house, the foundry, the workaround techniques, the supply chain of thousands of homegrown components, an entire parallel ecosystem stood up under fire, and the country has not stopped there. In the time since, China's chip makers have been pushing toward more advanced nodes, racing to build their own lithography machines, including their own attempts at the holy grail of EUV, and pouring fresh tens of billions into the effort. The progress is real, the gap is still real, and the yields are still brutal. All of that is true together. But the trajectory is unmistakable. The chip was not the destination, it was the starting gun. So return to that quiet day in 2023. An American official in Beijing working to manage a rivalry, while a banned Chinese company put a phone on sale that, on close inspection, contained a chip the entire American strategy had been written to make impossible. It was not a miracle, and it was not the end of the chip war. China was still years behind, the chips were expensive and hard to make, and the most important machine of all was still locked away. But it was a genuine breakthrough. Achieved under siege, and more than that, it was a signal. A signal that you can ban a country from buying a tool, but you cannot ban it from wanting independence badly enough to build everything itself, no matter the cost. The sanctions set out to keep China dependent. Instead, they may have convinced China, permanently, that it can never afford to be dependent again. And whether that turns out to be the masterstroke that held the line, or the mistake that forged a rival, is a question the whole world is still waiting to answer. If this changed how you understand the real war being fought over the chips inside everything you own, you know what to do. Subscribe. There is a lot more to show you.